Thank you very much for joining us on our webinar, What is the Role of Patient-Reported Data in Outcome-Based Contracts? My name is Elizabeth Earline, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This webinar is hosted by the National Health Council, which was founded 100 years ago by and for patient organizations. Our mission is to provide a united voice for the 160 million people living with chronic diseases and disabilities and their family caregivers. And the objective of today's webinar is to introduce the National Health Council's membership to the current landscape of outcome-based contracts, including a focus on patient-reported data. Just a reminder that for this webinar, if you have a question, please do submit it via the WebEx chat function. Here I've included a screenshot of how you access the chat function. If you look at the WebEx panel, it's the little thought bubble, and you just click on that and you can submit the question. We'll take questions at the end, and we do ask everybody to please stay on mute during the duration of today's call. I will read all of the questions and pose them to our speakers at the end of the presentation. And just a disclaimer that any media inquiries related to this topic should be directed to Jennifer Schleiman, our Assistant Vice President of Marketing and Communications. And finally, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers. We'll be hearing from two speakers today, John Linnehan and Sarah Butler. John serves as Practice Director of Health Economics and Advanced Analytics at Avalere, where he oversees a team of consultants, strategists, and data scientists focused on driving healthcare improvement through value demonstration, stakeholder engagement, predictive and applied analytics, and data innovation. And Sarah Butler serves as Head of Client Solutions, Marketing and Operations at Avalere, which includes account management, business development, and sales for life sciences, health plan, and provider clients. So with that, I am pleased to hand it over to John and Sarah.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I would also just love to offer one additional disclaimer. If there are any small children that chime in here, my apologies in advance. I'm sure you all can commiserate at this time. But regardless, John and I are both really excited to be here with this group today. This is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts in an area where we've done a lot of work for the past about 5-6 years now. And so the opportunity to be engaging closely with the National Health Council and patient advocacy organizations on this topic is really, really exciting to us. So if you can go ahead and go to the next slide. And again, the next one, please. Great. So what we are planning to cover today, we thought it would be helpful just to start with a little bit of level setting on what's the current landscape around outcomes-based contracts in the US healthcare system today. What are some of the trends that we are seeing? And I will do that with just some high-level remarks based on our experience and research. But then we will actually hand it over to John, who can go through our survey results. So Avalere, for 3 consecutive years now, has done a survey of US payers, so health plans in this case, to understand their experience with and perceptions of outcomes-based contracts. And since we've done this survey for a number of years now, we can capture some of the developments that we're seeing in this space. And then we'll talk about what we think is to come. And allow some time for Q&A. So please chime in if you have questions, and it sounds like the moderator will pose those at the end. So we'll make sure to leave a good amount of time for those. Go on to the next slide, please. Great. So with that, I'm going to dive in. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just a little bit about Avalere. If you're not familiar with Avalere, Avalere is a healthcare research, data-driven strategic advisory services firm. We are based in Washington, D.C., but have staff all across the country. We work closely with a wide range of healthcare stakeholders. I know we mentioned life sciences, health plan provider customers, We also work with patient advocacy organizations, professional societies, and also do a little bit of government work as well. 2020 is actually our 20th year in business. So we are very excited that a number of our clients have been with us throughout our entire journey, and are excited to continue to expand on our work. One additional thing about us that's particularly relevant to this topic is that Avalere is an Inovalon company. We were purchased by Inovalon 5 years ago, and that has been a great partnership for us. Inovalon is a healthcare technology company. And why I'm mentioning this is because it's relevant to outcomes-based contracts in two main ways. One, through Inovalon's work with health plans, they intake a large amount of data from Medicare Advantage plans, Medicaid managed care plans, commercial health plans, and we are also a qualified entity, which means that we have access to Medicare Parts A, B, and D data. And we use that data to both design outcomes-based contracts and also use our technology platform to operationalize outcomes-based contracts. So what we're sharing with you today is not only based on the primary research that I mentioned, but it's actually based on our experience of helping to design and operationalize outcomes-based contracts. Go to the next slide, please. Great. So a lot of you may have heard of outcomes-based contracts, and there's been some skepticism in the marketplace, but what we'll share with you today is that we're actually seeing a pretty significant uptick in both interest and execution of outcomes-based contracts. And just taking a step back and thinking about why this is, from our perspective and from the health plan perspective, it's actually quite clear that there's a number of factors that are driving this increased uptick. One is that health plans are increasingly operating with compressed margins. They don't have a lot of room for error. They've got to be highly efficient, and that means that they have to be very diligent in managing things like their drug spend, for example. I'm sorry? Okay, great. Also, as all of you know, the US population is increasingly aging and also sicker on average. Of course, COVID-19 aside, our patients typically in the US have more chronic conditions than other populations, are taking more medications, and are typically more complex and more difficult to manage, both in the commercial population as well as in the Medicare populations, and of course the Medicaid population as well, relative to other countries. Combine those two factors with increasing amount being spent on drugs, and also a large amount of innovation in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical space with a very significant pipeline, which we'll talk a little bit more about towards the end of the webinar. Health plans are really looking for ways to drive more value. And one of the things that they're using to do this is through the execution of outcomes-based contracts or value-based contracts. Go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And from a policy perspective, the Trump administration has been very focused on a number of things. One, decreasing net price for drugs specifically, lowering patient out-of-pocket costs, and also realigning incentives in the healthcare system in terms of how physicians are paid. So specifically thinking about adjusting payment for Part B products with the ASP +6 payment mechanism. There's been a number of policy proposals that have addressed these issues. To date, nothing has been successful, as you all know. There's still, rumors about an international pricing index, Part D reform specifically. There's been talks about, adjusting the PBM model as well. Our current perception, and I should share that this slide was created pre-last week. So our current perception is that, right now, based most recently on some of Grassley's tweets over the weekend, we do not anticipate that anything on drug pricing is going to be tied to the COVID stimulus package that is currently being debated in Congress. Previously, we had been projecting that there could potentially be some activity around the May 22nd budget deadline. In this current environment, I think that's very TBD based on how the next couple of months go with relate to the current pandemic. And otherwise, if nothing moves forward at that time, we're likely looking at post-election when we will see activity on drug pricing. Go to the next slide, please. So kind of just going back to OBCs and where the current landscape is, outcomes-based contracts are certainly not new. They've been done ex-US for a number of years, and they've also been done in the US. These are just a couple examples of what's actually out there in the public domain. However, we know firsthand that a number of agreements exist that are not publicly announced, just like other traditional contracts that you might be aware of. But there's a couple of these that I want to bring attention to because I think that they're actually kind of innovative. One would be Harvard Pilgrim's outcomes-based contract with Amgen's Repatha, which is a PCSK9 inhibitor. This contract is interesting. It's in its 4th year of inception, and each year the contract has gotten a little bit more aggressive in terms of the amount of risk that the drug manufacturer is being asked to take on. In the current form of the contract, it is a 12-month contract, and it works something like this. So for patients that are prescribed Repatha and are adherent for a minimum time period of 6 months, if a patient that meets that adherence criteria has an adverse event, in this case, one example would be a stroke, Amgen would repay the health plan for their costs for the drug, and in addition, also repay the patient for any out-of-pocket costs that they incurred for the drug. This is significant to me because it's actually the only example that I am aware of where the manufacturer would actually be reimbursing the cost for their reimbursing the patient for their costs that they have spent on the product. And I think that is something that we may see more of in the future. Another example that I think is really interesting is the Accredo example for Zolgensma. You may be aware that Zolgensma is a gene therapy. It launched with a very significant price tag, and Accredo actually negotiated a 5-year pay over time model with Novartis. So this is a little bit of a different model that we've seen in many of the other OBCs that have a traditional 12-month, kind of plan year time horizon. We're starting to see the risk being spread out over a longer time period and outcomes being measured across that entire time horizon. Another example that would be Harvard Pilgrim's contract with Spark Therapeutics for Luxturna as well. That's a 30-month contract where they measure both short and long-term outcomes across the time horizon of that contract. We'll share some more specific examples as we go through this, but this is just kind of a high-level overview of the current OBC landscape. Next slide. So I'm now going to transition it to John. I think, without further ado, we'd like to just dive into the survey. That's really where the meat of our presentation is. It's a great sample of, what's currently happening within health plans and gives you, I think, some vision into how patient organizations can engage in this space. And then after we share our results with you, we'll round out with some key takeaways and time for Q&A. So with that, John.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And also, before I begin, just also want to extend my thanks to National Health Council for having Sarah and myself on today's webinar to talk about this topic, and to everybody for joining. And I certainly hope that everyone is also staying well, given the environment that we're in at the moment. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And Sarah has mentioned this a little bit already, but what we thought would be a good foundation for talking through trends that we're seeing in outcomes-based contracting, and also kind of a jumping off point for discussions around patient-reported outcomes in OBCs and the role of patients in OBCs in general. We thought it would be helpful to talk through what we're seeing in the marketplace from the perspective of a payer-focused survey that Sarah mentioned previously, because it does address a lot of elements around how payers are approaching outcomes-based contracts, what benefits they see, what challenges they see, and what opportunities they see for the future, including things like an incorporation of patient-reported outcomes and other quote-unquote non-traditional outcomes compared to what we've seen in the past. And also, we've now done this for 3 years in a row, so there's an opportunity to start looking at trending. So a brief discussion, or a brief mention of methodology. Last summer, we conducted a web-based survey of decision makers pharmacy-related decision makers from 50 specific health plans, and I should mention there was probably about 45 health plans and 5 PBMs, so we really looked to cast a wide net when it comes to the definition of quote-unquote payer, representing about 60 million covered lives. We provided each respondent a uniform definition of an outcomes-based contract, which for the sake of apples-to-apples comparison, I'll cover briefly here, which is that an OBC is a plan by which the performance of the product is tracked in a defined patient population over a specified period of time, and the level of reimbursement is based on the health and cost outcomes achieved. With this definition, we can help enable that we're looking at a fair comparison across all of the responses of all of the health plans that we spoke to. Let's move to the next slide, and we'll show a set of slides that talk about some of the key findings in our analysis. This analysis was made available in an expanded version, and should anybody be interested in seeing the full report with these data, as well as more about our methodology and other data points that didn't make it into the webinar, we'd be happy to provide, and please let us know either through our contact information or via NHC following this webinar. As we go through this, there's 3 key themes that I think really help distill down what we found into a manageable point of view. The first is familiarity, the second is speed to impact, and the third is innovation and outcomes-based contracting. And specifically, we're seeing increases across each of these themes, and I'll identify and point out those areas. I also want to make sure that we take some time now and also at the end of my section and Sarah's to make sure that we're talking about specific tie-in relevant to patients and PROs, and specifically looking at the roles of PROs and outcomes-based contracts. And right now, I'll highlight 2 things. One is macro level, and one is more micro or granular implementation level. At a macro level, I would consider everything that I talk about over the next several slides as encouraging to patients, because my point of view is that when these contracts are well designed and implemented appropriately, the manufacturer is winning, benefiting, the payer is benefiting, and the patient is benefiting, because these are contractual arrangements that are not just tied to contracts between a buyer and a seller in terms of a payer and a pharmaceutical company. Those elements are certainly included, but as you saw in the definition on the previous slide, the degree to which there is money changing hands between groups is really dependent on the outcomes that are achieved by the patient. And when that's done appropriately and the payments are optimized, it would also imply that the patients are benefiting. So think about the increased familiarity, the increased speed to impact, and the increased innovation from that perspective. But also keep in mind, and we'll talk about this at the end, that implementation of these is trickier. I believe that from a patient-reported perspective, there is a recipe for success, but importantly, an opportunity for all those on this webinar to partner with sectors or stakeholders who maybe aren't on this webinar to ensure that the PRO instruments are well validated and designed to actually demonstrate the impact that an intervention actually has. And we have not seen, whether in our survey or in the work that Avalere is doing behind the scenes with these groups, to any significant degree, the inclusion of PROs in these contracts, which I think isn't necessarily a bad thing. I look at this as an opportunity for collaboration and improvement, and we're seeing some data that demonstrate that that health plans are interested in moving in that direction, and there's a few nice examples in the public domain. So with that as a precursor, let me show you a little bit about what we found. So the first is around the theme of familiarity. As you can see here in both the left-hand and right-hand panel, over the course of the past 3 years, we are seeing an increase in the number of plans who are very familiar with outcomes-based contracts, and a decrease in the number of plans who are less than very familiar. We also see an increase in conversation around outcomes-based contracts as a potential solution within health plan organizations. Almost half of health plans are discussing these as an opportunity for outcomes improvement, cost savings, and other benefits a great deal. If we go to the next slide, continuing with the theme of familiarity, we also asked plans not just around discussions, but also how many have outcomes-based contracts underway right now, and how many of those, how many. And what we found, as you can see on the right-hand side here, is a very steady and in some cases significant increase in the number of plans who have not just one or even 2 to 5, but more than 5 outcomes-based contracts in place with manufacturers, and a large proportion, 26%, additional 26% who don't have any now, but are currently in discussions, and a significant or steady decrease in the percent of health plans that don't have any outcomes-based contracts in place and are not planning to undertake any at the current time. So again, a steady increase in the, not just familiarity, but also the number of outcomes-based contracts in place. Next slide. Great. Next, we wanted to investigate the specific therapeutic areas where health plans have been pursuing outcomes-based agreements with manufacturer partners. And we're actually seeing an increase in popularity and interest really across the board. On the right side of this graph are conditions like endocrine, respiratory, and cardiovascular disease that historically have been very popular targets for outcomes-based contracts because they are therapeutic areas that have a significant population health impact for plans and significant spend. So maybe the products that treat the drugs that are treating these patients aren't the most expensive when you just consider the list or net price of a product, but when you consider the number of patients that actually have these conditions, the spend is significant. And that, you know, you can certainly relate to that for things like diabetes and heart failure, other cardiovascular, high cholesterol conditions, as well as things like asthma and COPD. So we're seeing continual interest over the past 3 years in these therapeutic areas. But what's interesting is that we're also seeing interest in therapeutic areas where prevalence might not be as high, but the price of the drugs treating those conditions are high. And that would include immune or inflammatory like MS or RA, oncology, as well as rare and orphan diseases. Rare and orphan diseases have often been areas that have not been targets, given the very unique nature of the conditions and the very small populations relevant. But given the price tag, given the price tag on these products and also lack of certainty regarding value because of little time on market, health plans have shown an increased interest in looking for outcomes-based agreements in these areas. And that Sarah provided an example of Novartis and Zolgensma previously. So from a patient perspective, I think what's important to take away here is that the individuals on this call, your constituents, whether it's therapeutic area specific or just kind of patient specific, are all really relevant to the conversation of outcomes-based contracts at this point, either because of the size of the therapeutic area within a health plan's population or because of the broader conversation to date around drug pricing. So I think that these are discussions that are worthwhile having really from the perspective of any patient advocacy group, whether it's therapeutic specific or otherwise, and what therapy that might be. Next slide. So we'll shift away from familiarity and more to speed to impact. And so one of the things that we always ask in our surveys is, what are the experienced advantages to date of outcomes-based contracts among those payers who have OBCs in place? And we provide a variety of options, and we allow the payers to choose more than one. which leads to what you see as some, tends to be variability in the numbers to a certain degree. It's important to keep in mind here that the respondents did not just have to choose one advantage, they could choose multiple advantages, which I think is actually quite interesting, and I'm glad that we do it this way. We have seen consistently the advantages of OBCs are what you might expect, cost savings, as well as improvement in patient outcomes. Although we have seen an increase in interest there, and I actually consider this general increase in perceived benefit of improvement in patient outcomes and cost savings, although it's been a little bit up and down, as indicating that over time, the efficiency by which these OBCs are done is getting better. And plans and manufacturers have gotten better at achieving the ultimate benefits of these agreements, which would be not just cost savings for a plan, but also improvement in patient outcomes, because of course the two are tied together. There are other benefits that are of interest here. I always find it interesting that a pretty significant number of plans also see the benefit of improvements in patient management and the capture of real-world information as significant benefits of these agreements, because that information can then be used to better inform the overall treatment of specific categories or specific therapeutic areas within those planned populations. And I think that from a patient-reported outcome perspective, maybe just more of a patient perspective more broadly, that's of interest and is showing that plans are thinking about things even beyond cost savings and outcomes improvements in these agreements. And the efficiency in which they're doing this is certainly improving. Next slide. Consistent with the conversation around speed to impact, I thought this data point, I always think this data point is nice to highlight, which is really of those payers who believe that cost savings are a benefit to the outcomes-based contracts that they're doing, what is the timeline by which they're realizing these cost savings? And what you can see here is that 62%, which was consistent with what we saw last year, which was the first year we asked this question, are seeing savings within the first 18 months of a contract, which a year and a half is actually well within the decision-making criteria or horizon for health plans. And so these are becoming less kind of experimental or conceptual engagements, and actually engagements in which there's cost savings to be had, which was an increase you saw on the prior slide, but also cost savings that can be had on in a relatively quick timeline, certainly one impactful to a health plan's business. And if you assume that those cost savings are also tied to improvements in patient outcomes, there's also a quicker time to benefit from a patient perspective as well. Next slide. So we talked through familiarity and speed to impact. So the third theme that I want to make sure to highlight is increases that we've seen in innovation. And I think there's a clear element of patient-reported outcomes and other patient-focused outcomes within this discussion. One of the questions that we asked health plans was around usage of ancillary services in the contract to improve the effectiveness of agreement. From an operational perspective, one of the key criteria required when a drug company puts a contract like this into place with a health plan is the need to ensure that at the end of the contract, there are enough patients who are eligible based on inclusion criteria, but who have remained adherent throughout or adherent enough throughout the term of the agreement, which tends to be a year or two, in order for the terms of the contract to even be applicable. Typically, the adherence minimum is set at 80%, so the patient needs to be 80% or more adherent over the course of the contract. And a lot of contracts historically have effectively ended up null and void because of these adherence and minimum patient thresholds. So there's a lot of activity that health plans are undertaking, and this is confirmed with the survey that we did, to really ensure that throughout the course of the contract, the risk of non-adherence or losing patients is minimized and the benefit can be realized. And so 60%, a little over 60% of health plans utilize patient adherence programs as a wraparound to the contract itself to keep patients on medication, which is obviously important from a patient perspective. If there's a benefit to be had, providing support in place to educate those patients and keep them adherent is beneficial. And half of the plans also did patient-focused interventions to promote follow-up over the course of the contract. So it may not have been adherence related, but it was, communication with the patient, education with the patient to see, are you taking your medication? Are you experiencing any challenges with taking the medication that you are taking? And if so, contact your provider or contact your health plan. And by encouraging patients to not just be adherent, but just be overall more engaged with their healthcare provider and the health plan over the course of the agreement is obviously going to keep them more compliant with the various inclusion and exclusion criteria in place, both related to adherence and otherwise. And so it's encouraging to see this level of innovation with which I think also benefits those patients who are receiving these interventions. Next slide. And then I'll pause here for a little bit because this is clearly relevant to the types of things that the individuals who are on this, what I believe the individuals on this webinar are interested in, which is that what are the measures and outcomes used by plans to measure value within the context of outcomes-based contracts? And in this case, we're considering payers who are considering outcomes-based contracts as well as, though it's not shown here, those who have undertaken OBCs in the past but are looking to kind of expand and innovate in how they're delivering them. And we ask this because historically speaking, most contracts, when we talk about the quote-unquote outcome, it's usually something that can be measured through cost or resource use utilization, like a office visit, physician office visit, a hospital outpatient department visit, a hospitalization, a readmission, an emergency department visit. These are all medical events or resource use events that cost the health plan money. And any opportunity to pay more for a drug perhaps, but also offset that cost and more by keeping patients out of the hospital or out of their doctor's office appropriately or out of the ED is a benefit to the plan. And but you can, when you think about the broad array of therapeutic areas that exist, there are all kinds of additional benefit that drugs are providing from a clinical perspective, from a patient-reported perspective, from a laboratory perspective that will never be, that are included in clinical trials, for instance, or patient registries, but often are not included in outcomes-based contracts because they don't carry a direct resource use or cost. And so we asked health plans, aside from those traditional measures, what additional outcomes would you like to see? And 75% of plans identified laboratory measures as key elements that they'd like to include, things like blood sugar, things like hemoglobin levels, things like, expression of certain biomarkers. When you think about oncology, for instance, are all measures that have been or are assumed to be tied to medical resource use and cost events. There's drug utilization measures related to compliance and related to number of infusions and things like that that are important to consider. And then there's patient-reported outcomes, which for the purpose of the survey were included in both symptom improvement and disease progression. We opted not to include PROs as a standalone category because a PRO is so flexible in what it can define that it wouldn't allow us to look at the other elements of outcomes. And so rather than have a PRO specific category, we looked at them as being included in things like symptom improvement, disease progression, or even financial measures when you think about the patient perspective. all of those outcomes, we're seeing nearly 50% of plans are interested, or more than 50% of plans are interested in including these measures, which is fantastic, but also means that more rigor needs to be put into implementation to be able to carefully tie these outcomes to what matters to plan. And before I turn back to Sarah to close out the discussion, I do want to pause here and talk a little bit more about that kind of recipe for success that I mentioned earlier. I did mention that when you think about inclusion of PROs within outcomes-based contracts, this is something that we don't often see in our surveys, and we don't often see behind the scenes in our strategy work with plans or manufacturers, which I think does offer an opportunity for innovation and partnership with those on this call and others in the healthcare space. And I also think that there are some examples about labs which are in a similar position in that they're not typically used as an outcome of interest in contracts, but we're seeing clearly from this slide a lot of interest, and we're doing a lot of work with manufacturers right now to help them demonstrate the tie between laboratory values and healthcare resource use and costs. And I think that can offer a nice recipe for patient-reported outcomes. One example of a PRO OBC example that I think is relevant to mention, and the only one that I've frankly seen publicly, was just this past November, an announcement between the UPMC health plan in Pennsylvania and Biogen, which is a manufacturer of multiple sclerosis drugs. And they put out a press release announcing an outcomes-based contract for 2 of their MS products, specifically linking payment to patient-reported measures of disability progression. And they actually cited a study that they had done with their outcomes research group at UPMC that had identified this as one of the most meaningful multiple sclerosis outcomes to patients. And UPMC, while the details aren't clear, has made an effort along with Biogen to track disease progression specifically from patients and tie those to payment in addition to presumably other resource use and cost elements that are included. This is the only example that we've seen publicly, but I do think it has a nice nice illustration of what is going to be important to make sure that PROs are included in these contracts more broadly. And I would really identify 4 key components that are important. The first, and Sarah will talk more about this as well, and perhaps foremost, is to actually ensure that PRO instruments are validated and co-developed between stakeholders in the healthcare system, many of which are on this webinar now, some of which are not. But there's an opportunity to create the right patient-reported outcomes that are appropriately validated to put in place in the first place, right? Patients are only going to benefit if we're using patient-reported outcomes that are appropriate and appropriately validated. The second key is to work with the plans to establish the connection of PROs to metrics important to the payer, those resource use and cost metrics that I talked about. We have done some of this work, as I mentioned, in laboratory space, significantly less work tying patient-reported outcomes to resource use and cost, but those data analyses are required to get the plans interested and help them understand that this is a reasonable metric. The third key is to work with a partner who can best operationalize these. And I look at this in 2 ways. The first is work with perhaps an integrated delivery network who already has a pre-baked provider-payer connection. And I think that UPMC is a great example of this. Geisinger, Intermountain are certainly others that you commonly think about, but having the integration between both the payer component and the provider component ensures that everybody has full skin in the game, but also ensures that the non-claims related metrics are perhaps more easily calculated. And if they're not more easily calculated, work with technology organizations who have the ability to facilitate these agreements by intaking data directly from plans, from patients, from EHR systems, and from laboratories to make sure that the connection is made. And Avalere is part of an organization who does that. And then the final thing that I'd say is a key for outcome PROs and OBCs is to consider a disease with a smaller prevalence to allow piloting the operational element of this. And I do think that multiple sclerosis is a nice example, because the prevalence is small enough that collecting PROs alongside outcomes-based contracts perhaps wouldn't require as many resources because of the sheer number of patients that are included, especially the patients taking a certain manufacturer's drugs. And so it offers a nice testing ground or piloting ground to be able to see whether this is something that can be operationalized more broadly in higher population therapeutic areas. So those are 4 areas that I believe are really key to bringing PROs into the picture more. And hopefully the data that I've shown from our survey demonstrate that there's opportunity there. So what I'd like to do now is skip the next slide, and which I purposefully skipped because I think it's less relevant to this discussion, and have Sarah kind of wrap everything up in a look ahead and then pause for questions.
Yeah, thank you, John. And we can go ahead actually to the next slide where we've captured some of the key themes. So what are the data telling us? What are we actually seeing here? We're seeing a couple of things. One, there's increased uptake, right? I remember very clearly being at a pretty well-known conference, which I won't mention now, about 4 years ago, when someone said, over my dead body, will we ever see OBCs in oncology? Well, I'm pretty sure that individual is still thriving and well, and there have been OBCs in oncology. And I actually anticipate that there's going to be increased interest. So that's just like a funny little anecdote about the skepticism that we've seen in this space, but yet we still see that, these are increasing, and 60%, nearly 60% of payers implementing OBCs is no small sample. That's a pretty significant portion of the market. So, I think that these are here to stay. And that means for everyone on this call that's actively engaging in this space needs to be aware of why this is happening, what the opportunities are, and how you can engage to help shape the future. The other thing that we're seeing is that OBCs are becoming more impactful and more efficient. So we're seeing results faster. So the fact that on average, health plans can see value in terms of cost savings and improved outcomes within 18 months, and that looks like it's decreasing over time, is actually pretty significant. So, I think that means that we will also continue to see more of these. And then lastly, we've really seen like a really lovely unintended consequence of some of these agreements is that relationships amongst healthcare stakeholders are improving as a result of these types of contracts. So we're seeing manufacturers and payers be able to partner not just on a contract, but actually how do we best manage this population? And I think that can really be also an opportunity for patient organizations to get more heavily engaged here. I can say that I've been a part of quite a few of these agreements now, and not once has there been a patient organization at the table. And that's something that I would really like to see change. And so I think for all of the patient groups on the line today, there's a bit of a call to action here. These agreements could be much more effective if they were certainly focused around outcomes that actually matter to patients. Because I think there's an opportunity to create more alignment from, the plan manufacturer and the patients around what do we actually think is important here. And it doesn't just have to be one outcome that you're tracking, right? Like it doesn't have to be overall healthcare utilization or overall cost of care. There can be other outcomes that we know are going to be really impactful to patients. And that's really a win-win-win for everyone involved. So to the extent that you can kind of engage with manufacturers or health plans earlier on in those conversations, I think it can present a real opportunity for improvement in this space. If you want to go to the next slide, there's a couple of other takeaways. John already made the point about increasingly seeing organizations that can help operationalize these agreements. This is particularly relevant for health plans that don't have kind of the technology infrastructure to be intaking a lot of data and assessing results on an ongoing basis. So What's less desirable is that you have to wait until the plan year is completed to analyze retrospectively the claims data for that plan year. We don't have to exist in that world anymore. We actually have technology that is intaking data much faster than that and can provide as close to real time as possible visualization of results. And that also enables us a great advantage in terms of how we leverage the data and the results that we're seeing. So, John mentioned that increasingly we're starting to see OBCs that include wraparound services or adherence services or more tools that can actually engage patients around how to better manage care for that patient. I expect that will continue and it will be enabled by healthcare technology. So, the days of, just using an Excel spreadsheet to analyze claims can be gone. I know that still exists today, but if we're actually able to leverage, cloud-based platforms that can intake data, look at what we're seeing in the population, identify areas for additional improvement, that's really key to kind of improving care across the board, which I think we all agree is desirable. If you want to go to the next slide. One of the things that we haven't had a lot of time to dive into, but in addition to outcomes-based contracting, we're seeing a lot of attention around kind of this range of alternative financing models. And this is particularly accelerated because of the really tremendous pipeline that exists today in the cell and gene therapy space. So as some of you may know, there are over 800 investigational new drug applications. So kind of the filing that happens in the FDA process before actually filing for approval. There's over 800 cell and gene therapies in the pipeline today. Many of those are in the oncology space. Many of those are in the rare disease space. Many of these treatments are durable and potentially curative. And that means that they offer a high value and likely have a pretty high price point. So, payers and other stakeholders, including manufacturers, are thinking about how is the healthcare system today going to evolve to actually pay for some of these potentially curative therapies in the future. We've seen some experimentation. As I mentioned, the pay over time model for Zolgensma. There's a number of other options that are being contemplated. On this slide, we've kind of organized these into 3 buckets. One is benefit design and coverage models. We put outcomes-based contracts in this bucket. This is really anything that adjusts the coverage or the benefit design or the reimbursement for the drug based on outcomes or based on some agreed upon metrics or just really adjusts kind of the insurance model. The other is health plan risk economic models. These are things like increasing reinsurance or stop loss coverage to ensure that health plans could, have some reinsurance protection for some of these high value treatments. Others are things like drug mortgages that you've heard of. And then there's some of these new age models. We put these like drug subscription models. You've probably heard of the hepatitis C engagements, for Gilead's product in the state of Louisiana, as well as the state of Washington, that have implemented these quote Netflix models. They're not really Netflix models in terms of, paying a fee and it's kind of all the drug you can eat. It's actually more of an expense cap or an expense management mechanism for the state. They've been successful in that they've increased access to the drugs. I don't anticipate that those are going to be scalable across all these other types of therapies. So main point being that we're going to see a lot of experimentation in the next couple of years as we have more durable, high value, high cost therapies coming to market. Outcomes-based contracts can be one solution, but I expect that we'll see more experimentation in this area with some of these other types of models. And I also think it's an opportunity for the patient community to be having a voice in what this looks like. And how do we really ensure that it's not the patients who end up suffering by not having access to potentially curative therapies as a result of, the health insurance system not being able to handle these high value treatments. So next slide, a little bit of time for question. This really kind of rounds up some key takeaways. This is our last content slide. So we've talked about how OBCs are growing. in terms of the number that exists today and the interest in the marketplace. We've talked about how some of these more novel and innovative therapies coming to market are going to drive some change in terms of financing and payment models. We talked about the opportunity for third-party entities to incorporate different types of data sources to operationalize OBCs and operationalize more sophisticated OBCs as a result, and also, an increased demand for third parties to be a partner to different stakeholders here. And I just want to reiterate the point that both John and I have made. It's not explicitly stated here. There's absolutely a role for patient organizations in these discussions. And I think that, the imperative is a little bit on you to make a case for that and make that known, and really to get your voice heard in some of these discussions. So with that, I think we've got about 9 or 10 minutes left here. If there's questions that have come in, we'd be happy to take them or can take any live.
Great. Well, thank you so much, John and Sarah, for the wonderful presentation. Just a reminder for folks who are on the line, if you have a question that you would like to submit, please do so via the chat function using the little bubble that's there, and I'll post the questions to our speakers. So Sarah and John, we've already had a couple of questions come in during the presentation. And the first one is actually a question about how are the outcomes determined, and then how are the outcomes linked back to the clinical trial outcomes that were used for approval? And are they the same outcomes? Are they different outcomes? If you could speak a little bit about that, please.
Yeah.
Sarah, I'm happy to go, Sarah, since you just finished your section. Give you a little break. It's a great question. I would say sometimes there is a clear translation between clinical trial outcomes and sometimes not. I will say oftentimes the answer is not directly, because as I mentioned, the outcomes that we're typically seeing in outcomes-based contracts are resource use and cost-based outcomes. And these are not necessarily all of the most frequent outcomes that we're seeing in clinical trials. In clinical trials, we're often looking at clinical measurements of functional status or other, not necessarily patient-reported, but clinical or laboratory-derived measures of success that are appropriate from a clinical perspective, but aren't clearly tied to a change in emergency department visits or hospitalizations, for instance. So oftentimes what we'll see is an adaptation of those clinical trial-based outcomes to things like office visits or cost for the purpose of an outcomes-based contract. Sometimes this is done based on thresholds that are calculated in a clinical trial for lack of better evidence, but for some products that have been on the market for some time, the health plan has a reasonable idea of how many hospitalizations they typically see for COPD exacerbations, for instance, and can derive a baseline based on that.
Thank you. Another question that came in, and I'm not sure if you will know the answer to this, but I thought it was a good question, was among the examples you mentioned, was there any difference in patient out-of-pocket cost tier level for the contracted drug compared to the other drugs in the same class?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all that question, but I think it was, for the examples that we mentioned, were there any differences in out-of-pocket costs for the patient?
Exactly. So with the treatments that were under the outcomes-based contract, were they did they have reduced out-of-pocket costs, or maybe they were a priority tier or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So typically for an outcomes-based contract, it could be negotiated up front between the manufacturer and the health plan, preferred placement on formulary, which would, as a result, likely yield less out-of-pocket costs for the patient. That's certainly possible. But the nature of the question actually sounds a little bit more like a value-based insurance design or a VBID type model. So both are possible, but it's typically what you would see is some sort of preferential treatment on access for the manufacturer in these outcomes-based agreements as a result. So yes, possible. But typically what we are not seeing, like you could see in a VBID and OBCs, you're not seeing the amount of out-of-pocket that a patient experiences vary based on their outcomes. We are not seeing that today.
Okay. And then along those same lines, you mentioned the example where patients' out-of-pocket costs were being covered by the manufacturer. One question that was submitted was if patients who are being covered under an outcomes-based contract are aware that they're being covered under that type of a mechanism.
Yes, that's true. And the onus for that would be on the plan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Another question is in regards to the call to action. So oftentimes the outcomes-based contracts are proprietary. So would the call to action for manufacturers and payers be to include patient groups and share information? The data around these contracts are private. So while patient groups can guide discussions around what is most important to patients, but have no access to the data the agreements provide that can help patient care. So I guess one question from that is if you have further suggestions for the types of people within plans or within pharma that you would suggest that patient groups reach out to become more engaged in outcomes-based contracts.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback. I'll start with a response, and I'm sure that John has other feedback as well. That's a great point, and you're absolutely right. I think that the engagement should not be, hey, let's have a conversation about this. It needs to be very targeted and informed, ideally by some analytics to substantiate what outcomes a patient group would recommend for a specific therapeutic area or drug class, for example, that are highly impactful to patient outcomes. So I think that there's an opportunity to do some analytics on the patient side and then collaborate with other stakeholders around what you think actually drives value in a specific area. In terms of specific individuals, typically at a health plan, the stakeholders who are doing these contracts tend to manage their pharmacy spend. So it could be their chief pharmacy officer. It really depends on the plan, but they're actually managing kind of the P&L for the pharmacy line. We've seen some of these contracts actually go to the CMO level at a health plan as well, particularly if the outcomes of interest do not just impact the pharmacy spend, but can also impact the medical side as well. And on the manufacturer side, these folks are typically sitting within pricing and contracting functions. I don't know, John, if you've got other thoughts as well.
The only thing I'll add is I wouldn't presuppose that the patients or patient groups like those on this webinar would be purposefully held out of seeing the information on the performance of a contract that they were involved in. So I think maybe that's been the case to date, but there actually hasn't been too many of these agreements to date where we've looked at PROs in the first place. And so I do think that if you took an example like the UPMC Biogen example, there is a place in there for patient groups within an MS space, for instance. And I think being a clear party to the development of the right instruments and the right outcomes and the design of what this could look like from an innovative perspective, I don't think that it would be a guarantee that you would not benefit from also seeing the results.
Yeah. And then one final question is, Sarah, it sounds like there might have been somebody on the line who was in the same meeting as you who heard 4 years ago that there would be no, that this would not happen in oncology. And so it's a fairly specific question, but I'll pose it is, If you could speak to what oncology, what areas within oncology are most involved in or covered under outcomes-based contracts so far, and what might have been identified as areas of interest within oncology.
That's a great question. Our research actually hasn't gone into specific types of oncology or tumor types, but we've seen some interest in some of the more rare types of tumor types. And we've also seen some interest in actually doing these around some of the combination therapy regimens as well. So good. That's actually a really great suggestion for how we could enhance our survey this year. So thank you very much for the question. And maybe separately we can connect if it was the same conference. That would be fine.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, John and Sarah. We really appreciate your time presenting today. It was very informative, and it will be recorded. It was recorded and will be available on our website for folks who want to go back and look at any specific slides or sections again. But again, thank you so much, John and Sarah, for your time and for preparing for the webinar today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Stay safe, everyone.
Thank you. And we will take a break from our patient-focused medicines series next month. We'll focus on providing a couple of additional webinars related to the coronavirus. We had our first one about a week and a half ago, and intend to have a couple of additional webinars for our NHC community and others over the next month. So stay tuned for emails about those, and we'll be back with another webinar on the patient-focused medicines development within the next couple of months. Thank you. Take care.